Hello, welcome back. I'm gonna take a look at this magazine. May 1966. Interview Arthur Schlesinger Jr. A candid conversation with the erudite Harvard historian, former White House advisor, and best-selling author of 1,000 Days, the controversial chronicle of the dynamic Kennedy years. Whoops. The bombing of North Vietnam is a mistake. It's less likely to demoralize the North Vietnamese than to anger and so solidify them behind the regime. That war can be fought only with ground forces. The great thing Kennedy did during the missile crisis was to be very precise in the use of power. What was frightening about the Dominican crisis was Johnson's lack of precision in the use of power. I'm not a believer in the perfectibility of a man. It's hard to see any irresistible drive toward perfection or even progress in a century of genocide, napalm bombing, and nuclear warfare. Whoops. There's some questions. Holy Jesus. Here's the first question. Your fellow historian Arnold Toynbee has denounced the U.S. decision to intervene in the Vietnam War. He has charged that in refusing to recognize that the Viet Cong represent a national liberation movement made by the South Vietnamese themselves, and in attributing the war wholly to communist intervention from outside, the United States is unintentionally making herself the hire of European colonialism in Asia. Is there any truth to this charge? I don't think so. Toynbee has his facts wrong. He talks about our attributing the war wholly to communist intervention from the outside, but our 1961 white paper on the subject makes it quite clear that the problem was the combination of a local civil war in South Vietnam with increasing support from North Vietnam. Whatever some of our government officials may have said since then in moments of rhetorical exuberance, everyone in Washington must realize that this began as a civil war, although it has taken on other dimensions now. Nor do I think, as Toynbee alleges, that we have assumed the burden of European colonialism. I do think there is a possibility, however, that as we increase our visible presence there, this may be a perceived effect, an unintended effect. President Kennedy, who had visited Indochina in 1951, was very much aware of the extent to which French policy had alienated all Vietnamese nationalists. He was always concerned not to enlarge our commitment to such an extent as to change the character of the war. We had only 20,000 troops in Vietnam before the recent build-up. Now we have 235,000. At some point, just through increase in visibility of our presence, the war may cease to be seen as a Vietnamese war and come to be regarded by others as a colonial war, a white man's war. But if Toynbee implies that an honest South Vietnamese nationalist couldn't be a nationalist against the North Vietnamese and communism as well as against the French and Americans, he's wrong. After all, Diem, whom we supported, was a very strong nationalist in his way, while at the same time strongly anti-communist. Okay. Are we close? No, never mind, never mind. Can we realistically hope for a peace settlement if we insist on negotiating, as we have, only with Hanoi and not with the Viet Cong? No, though the administration has already made it clear that we'll talk to the Viet Cong if they come to the conference table disguised as North Vietnamese. But that's not enough, of course. Obviously, the Viet Cong are parties to the conflict and should be recognized as such, just as the Pathet Lao were recognized in the Geneva negotiations of 1961 and 1962. In Senator Fulbright's recent speech criticizing the administration's policies in Latin America, he said that we misread prevailing tendencies in Latin America by overlooking or ignoring the fact that any reform movement is likely to attract communist support. We thus failed to perceive that if we are automatically to oppose any reform movement that communists adhere to, we are likely to end up opposing every reform movement, making ourselves the prisoners of reactionaries. Do you agree? Yes, but I'd go a step further. If we are going to oppose every revolution just because communists support it, we are going to breed communists. In one phase of any revolution, obviously communists will support it, but that doesn't reason enough for us to oppose it. For example, the dictatorship of Perez Jimenez in Venezuela was overthrown in 1958 by the Democratic Action Party led by Betancourt. He was supported by the communists. If we had followed the theory of our Dominican intervention and rejected Betancourt because of this and stuck by Perez Jimenez, it would have been a fatal mistake. For Betancourt was a strong anti-communist. He led a socially progressive reform regime which attacked communism by tackling the problems that breed communism. And when the communists became terrorists, he suppressed them. How can we avoid finding ourselves boxed in again between a corrupt dictatorial regime on one side and a communist-led revolution on the other? Well, the only thing to do is to explore and exploit every possible alternative long before the choice narrows down to that. We ought to support governments like the Leone government in Venezuela and the Frey government in Chile. We ought to provide aid, and we ought to use what influence we have, as we have been doing through the Alliance for Progress, to get Latin American governments to do the kinds of things that will bring about economic development and social change. The communists know this, which is why the governments they fear most are the progressive ones. The government that Castro hates most in Latin America, for example, is the Venezuelan government. He doesn't worry about the dictatorships in Latin America because the longer you have a dictatorship, the more communist it's going to breed. You have said that we ought to supply economic and military aid to those governments that favor a progressive democratic solution. We have invested several $billion worth of aid in Vietnam without being able to bring about a stable democratic regime in Saigon. India and Pakistan, both of whom have received substantial U.S. military aid, have directly or indirectly used it to fight each other. In view of such examples as these, some senators and congressmen feel that the foreign aid program has been a failure. Do you? You have to distinguish between forms of aid. This massive aid you speak of has been mostly military assistance, and the India-Pakistan thing, as you point out, certainly reveals the defects of the military assistance programs. A lot of liberals who have turned against foreign aid have turned against it because of the military assistance side. Senators Gruning and Morse, for example. I don't think there's any easy solution. I don't think we can say that we're simply not going to give any more military assistance. Nonetheless, that part of the foreign aid program desperately needs very critical reconsideration. What can or should the U.S. do to expedite this break? Well, what break? Once more. That's a long answer. There have been many reports lately about the introduction of the profit motive in certain sectors of the Soviet economy. The so-called Lieberman reforms. This has led to the suggestion that Russia may gradually become more capitalist, while America moves toward a more socialist economy. The theory is that the US and the USSR will meet somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, with both countries employing some form of mixed economy. Do you regard this as plausible? Well, I think there are limits to this sort of thing. I doubt very much whether private property is going to be restored in the Soviet Union, and I doubt very much whether we're going to nationalize very many things in the US. In Eastern Europe, on the other hand, there's much greater argument, discussion, and experimentation. Yugoslavia for a long time has been experimenting with a kind of free market socialism. The Lieberman proposals in the Soviet Union represent an adaptation of certain elements of the Yugoslav experiments. But I think the Soviet Union has a long way to go before it gets away from all its encompassing dogmatism. What about Lyndon Johnson? Would you regard him as a great president? It's too early to tell. One can't venture any judgments until the end of an administration. Unquestionably, however, he has already proved himself to be a very considerable president. It's been said that he lacks the personal charisma that Kennedy had. Do you feel that's true? It's like sex appeal in women. Some have it and some don't. Johnson may yet acquire it. He may not. It's a matter of personal chemistry. Presidents can be very effective. Presidents without it. The shift from Kennedy to Johnson was not unlike that from Roosevelt to Truman. But the fact that Truman lacked some of the charismatic qualities that Roosevelt had didn't mean that Truman was not an extraordinarily effective and able president. The reason subsequently given by the White House for sending in so many troops was to forestall a communist coup d'etat. If there had been evidence that it was a communist takeover attempt, the evidence would have been persuasive enough to get a number of other Latin American nations to act with us, so it wouldn't have had to be a unilateral intervention. But there never was convincing evidence, in my judgment, or apparently in that of the Latin American nations at the time, that it was a communist revolution. If I had believed it was, I would have supported intervention. Before World War II, the extreme right was identified with isolationism. Yet today, the conservatives call for a militant anti-communist stance in the international arena. Has the right wing abandoned isolationism? Isolationism has taken different forms. The isolationist emotions are not dead, but right-wing isolationism now tends to mean unilateral action by the U.S. isolation from our allies or from our international commitments. Do you feel that such acts of civil disobedience are morally justifiable? If, in the tactics of a given situation, defying a bad law and going to prison is going to help get rid of that law, yes, their actions can be defended as tactics. To return to student protests for a moment, do you think the scope and the vehemence of the campus demonstration against the war in Vietnam have been or are likely to be heeded by President Johnson? Well, He's certainly not going to heed any naive admonitions for unilateral U.S. withdrawal and abandonment of the South Vietnam to unconditional self-determination. But by the time most of the teach-ins and student demonstrations had taken place, the president had already declared his support of negotiation and thus to some degree cut the ground from under them. There have been numerous articles lately about intellectual disenchantment with Johnson. To what degree do you think this has been inspired by his non-intellectual Southwestern style? Well, I don't think very much, because the contrast between Kennedy and Johnson is, again, no greater than between Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. Truman was a very popular figure among many of the liberals who are now somewhat reserved about Johnson, and Truman had his accent and idiosyncrasies, his homely qualities, so I don't think Johnson's manner is a critical factor. As a matter of fact, some liberals were quite prepared to like Johnson better than Kennedy. There was a time when you felt an undercurrent of that sort because they thought Kennedy was too much like themselves to be a really good president. Do you see any men on the national scene who might emerge as effective leaders of a revitalized Republican Party? A few years ago, I would have thought Rockefeller might have been able to do it, but he's past his time. There's some admirable Republicans in the Senate, however, notably John Sherman Cooper and Tommy Kuchel, who are both men of great ability and wisdom. And John Lindsay is obviously a very promising figure. What do you think will ever... never mind. Do you think the struggle will... Never mind. You have written about the distinction between quantitative liberalism and qualitative liberalism. Is this what divides Johnson from the Kennedys in Washington? No, quantitative liberalism has to do with supplying the stark necessities of life, a job, a roof over your head, meals, clothes, and that sort of thing. Qualitative liberalism has to do with the kind of life people live, the capacity for self-fulfillment in society, programs for natural beauty, aid to education, civil rights, and government support for the arts are all part of what I would call qualitative liberalism. Both the New Frontier and the Great Society have done a good many things to improve the quality of American life and of American lives. Well, that's the end of that book, magazine. Okay. See ya.